The wind that afternoon carried the taste of alkali and old sorrow, rolling low across the flats outside Mesilla like a restless animal searching for something it had once buried. Wagon wheels groaned over rutted earth, and the sun leaned heavy on the backs of men who had long ago stopped expecting mercy from it. I remember the smell most clearly: sun-warmed leather, mule sweat, a faint trace of gunpowder drifting from the direction of the range beyond town. My name is Elias Boone Calder, 30 years old by the grace of stubbornness, rancher by inheritance rather than ambition, and a man more familiar with silence than with company. I had come into town that day for seed and lamp oil, meaning to leave before dusk pressed its questions against the windows of the saloon. I did not yet know that by sundown my quiet life would be carrying someone else's fear beneath its canvas. Mesilla in late summer hums with a tension that never quite rises to violence, yet never settles into peace. The mercantile door bangs too hard against its frame. The blacksmith's hammer rings like a warning instead of a welcome. Even the church bell sounds unsure of its authority. I guided my wagon along the edge of the street, keeping to the dust rather than the boards, because dust forgives the weight of a man who prefers not to be noticed. Folks in town call me steady, which is a polite way of saying solitary. My father had built our ranch with his bare hands, and a temper that cracked like dry timber. When he died 3 winters ago, he left me land and an unspoken instruction: endure. I have done little else since. I had just tied the reins outside the mercantile when I saw her. She came from the narrow alley beside the store, skirts gathered in one fist, bonnet hanging loose at her back like something abandoned mid-thought. She was not running wildly. She was moving with purpose sharpened by fear. Dust clung to the hem of her blue calico dress, and there was a thin streak of dirt along her cheek where she must have brushed at tears she refused to let fall. Her name, I would learn within minutes, was Clara May Hollister, 25 years old and 6 months a widow. But in that first glance she was simply a woman who had reached the edge of her options. She saw me because I was there and because I was alone. That is how fate often works in small towns. It chooses the quiet man who cannot pretend he did not witness something. Her eyes met mine with an intensity that startled me. They were not soft eyes, though they were rimmed red. They were eyes accustomed to measuring danger quickly, and deciding whether to stand or to step aside. She crossed the distance between us in a breath that felt longer than it should have. "Please," she said, her voice low and steady despite the tremor beneath it, "let me hide in your wagon before my in-laws find me." There are moments when a man understands that whatever answer he gives will echo longer than the sound of his own name. I glanced past her shoulder and saw them at the far end of the street. 2 riders dismounting in unison, boots hitting the dirt with the confidence of men who believe the world owes them obedience. The Hollister brothers. I knew them by reputation if not by friendship. Broad-shouldered, quick to anger, fond of reminding others that blood entitles a man to whatever he can intimidate into his grasp. Their younger brother had died in a mining collapse last winter, and with him, apparently, their patience. "What are they after?" I asked, not because I needed convincing, but because I needed to hear her speak her truth. "My husband's claim," she answered. "The house. The deed stands in my name. They say it ought to return to the family. They say a widow cannot be trusted to hold property alone." She did not cry. She did not plead for sympathy. She stated facts like a ledger being read aloud, each line weighted with insult. In her stillness I sensed both exhaustion and defiance. She had already argued her case somewhere behind those walls, perhaps in a kitchen heavy with smoke and accusation. She had chosen flight not from cowardice, but from the certainty that reason would not be heard. The brothers had begun scanning the street. One pointed toward the mercantile, and my chest tightened in a way I had not felt since boyhood, when my father's shadow filled the doorway at night. I looked at Clara again. She stood straight despite the urgency of the moment, as though dignity were the last possession she refused to surrender. "If I help you," I said quietly, "they will come asking why." "They are already asking," she replied. "I would rather owe a stranger a kindness than owe them my life." That sentence moved something in me I had long believed calcified. Owe them my life. I thought of my own inheritance, of land held not by love but by endurance. I thought of how easily a woman alone could be folded back into a family that valued property more than consent. The town watched without appearing to watch. Windows glinted. Conversations stalled. Without another word, I lifted the edge of the wagon's canvas. "Climb in." She did not hesitate. She gathered her skirts and stepped onto the wheel hub, then into the shadowed hollow where feed sacks and seed crates offered uneven refuge. As the canvas fell back into place, I caught the faint scent of lavender soap beneath the dust. It struck me as fiercely human amid the dryness of everything else. The Hollister brothers reached me moments later. Their faces bore the polite masks men wear before they choose to drop them. "Calder," the elder one said, his voice heavy with expectation, "you seen our sister-in-law about?" I met his gaze and let my own remain steady. "I have seen many things today," I answered, "none of them belonging to me." His eyes narrowed. He stepped closer to the wagon, as if proximity might force truth to spill. My pulse beat hard enough to shake memory loose from my ribs, yet I did not move aside. Silence can be armor when worn without apology. "She has nowhere to go," the younger brother muttered. "Best she remember who her people are." "Maybe she does," I said, "and maybe that is the trouble." They held my stare a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed, then turned away with a promise folded into their posture. "This is not finished," the elder called over his shoulder. I climbed onto the driver's seat and gathered the reins. My hands felt different on the leather, as though they belonged to a man who had already chosen more than solitude. When the wagon rolled forward, I sensed her breathing beneath the canvas, measured, contained, alive. I did not know yet what sheltering her would cost, only that leaving her to those men would cost more. As Messia receded behind us in a haze of dust and suspicion, I realized the road ahead no longer belonged solely to me, and somewhere behind that thin stretch of canvas, fear was turning into something far more dangerous for a lonely rancher's heart. The wagon rattled over the worn trail, each bump sending a subtle tremor through the canvas that covered Clara May's hiding place. She breathed in carefully, not wanting to startle the horses or the man whose quiet authority had already impressed itself upon her awareness. I drove in silence, the reins loose in my calloused hands, listening more than looking. The wind carried scents of wild sage and dry earth, a mix so familiar it felt like home yet tainted by the unease of pursuit. Dust swirled in the golden late afternoon light, coating our skin in the grit of the frontier, reminding me that this land demanded respect, whether you lived on it or fled through it. I had hauled feed and seed through these tracks 1,000 times, yet today each creak of the wagon sounded like a footstep closer to a life I had never imagined sharing with another. The first mile passed without incident. I could feel her presence beneath the canvas, a quiet tension that pressed against the weave of the fabric like an unspoken question. Her hands, I imagined, were folded tightly in her lap, fingers entwined in a silent prayer for safety. I remembered my own hands as a boy, small and uncertain, holding a hammer for the first time, trying not to mar the wood. Perhaps she was measuring her courage in the same way, reminding herself she had survived worse storms than the threats of two hot-tempered brothers. My wagon, my solitary companion for years, had become a vessel not only for grain, but for the fragile pulse of a life that demanded protection. And in that, I recognized the weight of responsibility I had not sought but could not deny. We reached the outskirts of the settlement just as the sun began its slow descent, spilling a honeyed glow across the plains. Here the air smelled different. Sweat mixed with wildflowers pressed into the low grass, the river somewhere beyond carrying a faint metallic tang. I eased the wagon to a halt behind a copse of mesquite, careful to keep us hidden from any wandering eyes. Clara May emerged cautiously, brushing dust from her skirts with hands that had already learned discretion. Her face bore the faint traces of fear and exhaustion, but there was a steadiness in her posture that I found remarkable. She was young, yes, but in her eyes was a maturity forged by loss, by expectation, by survival. She did not look to me for permission, yet she allowed me the subtle acknowledgement of space and guidance as we moved toward my modest ranch beyond the riverbank. The ranch lay nestled against a gentle rise, its weathered timber reflecting the late light in warm tones of amber and copper. 2 horses grazed lazily near the fence line, indifferent to the world yet tethered to the reality of their dependence. A small herd of cattle rustled in the distance, a steady reminder of the rhythm of life that persisted regardless of human concern. I opened the gate slowly, letting the wagon ease through. and in that moment I understood the unspoken measure of trust we had already begun to exchange. She did not ask questions about my land or the fences or the barn. She merely followed, attentive to the sounds of her surroundings, as if every footfall might carry danger or comfort in equal measure. Inside the barn, I let her down carefully. The scent of hay and leather enveloped us, heavy with the warmth of animal life. Clara May glanced around, noting the utilitarian order of the place, the faint evidence of a man who worked with his hands, who measured life in practicality rather than ceremony. I caught her eye and nodded toward the hay loft, suggesting without words a place for her to rest. She inclined her head slightly, understanding the gesture without requiring explanation. There was an unspoken agreement forming between us, fragile yet potent, that this space was temporary but safe. She moved with a grace that belied the urgency of her arrival, smoothing her skirts as she climbed a few rickety steps to settle among the stacked hay bales. For hours, we moved within our separate duties, but within the same orbit of existence. I repaired a broken fence post, the hammer striking with the rhythm of a heartbeat, while she swept the small cabin I had not bothered to tidy in months, dust rising like ghosts disturbed by care. She sang softly at one point, a melody without words, a hum that wove itself into the walls and the air and the shifting dust motes. I paused, listening, and realized that her presence had already begun to alter the atmosphere of this place. The walls that had once echoed only my solitude now held space for resilience, for warmth, for a quiet defiance against the world outside. It struck me that sheltering her was more than a protection of body. It was an offering of something I had long withheld, the willingness to allow another life into the rhythm of mine. Dinner was simple: bread, salted beef, and a small ration of beans from the larder. She insisted on setting the table, placing a tin cup beside mine with the care of someone who knew the value of small gestures. The firelight flickered across her features, highlighting the sharp curve of her cheek and the subtle tension in her jaw. I noticed the way she studied the flames as if seeking answers among the shadows. For a moment, I wondered if she thought me harsh, or uncaring, or incapable of understanding. Perhaps she was correct. I had been alone for years, and solitude tends to teach a man only what he can endure, not what he can share. As night fell, the temperature dropped just enough to make the plain air bite, and the barn smelled of warmed hay and the faint musk of the horses. Clara May finally spoke, her voice low and hesitant, as though testing its own courage. She asked about my past, my family, my life before the quiet, and I answered in fragments, not because I wished to hide, but because I was discovering that words could be both bridge and barrier. My mother had died when I was too young to understand grief. My father, a stern man who had trusted work over words, left me a ranch and the expectation of endurance. And now, with her here, I found myself explaining pieces of a man I had not yet fully known, revealing the small tenderness I had buried beneath practicality. She listened without judgment, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And when I fell silent, it was she who filled the quiet with understanding. She spoke of her husband's death, the debts that lingered like unwelcome shadows, the fear that her in-laws carried for her autonomy. She did not beg or plead. She stated her circumstances plainly, measured against a life that demanded clarity in every step. And in the way she spoke, I perceived not desperation, but a fierce assertion of selfhood. A woman who had already faced loss and intended to survive on her own terms. Days passed like this, the rhythm of our coexistence forming as naturally as the rising sun. We spoke sparingly, each conversation deliberate, each gesture weighted with significance. She mended torn clothing, repaired minor damage to the cabin, and in quiet ways made the space feel less barren. I tended the land, repaired fences, and allowed her presence to soften the edges of my solitude. At times I would catch her watching me, as if measuring not just my actions but the steadiness of my character, and I realized that in her gaze there was both assessment and a quiet hope. Perhaps she sought not protection alone, but recognition of her bravery, acknowledgement that survival was a skill worthy of respect. Our silence was occasionally punctuated by the distant echo of town gossip. A ranch hand named Silas Crow, passing along the main trail, warned me of the whispers that had begun circulating. That I was harboring a widow improperly, that scandal was inevitable if I allowed her to remain. I listened, weighing his words not with fear but with consideration. Clara May's presence was neither scandal nor inconvenience. It was a choice I made consciously. And yet I understood that the world beyond my fences measured value differently, often more concerned with propriety than with courage or kindness. One evening, the sun low and blood-red against the horizon, she emerged from the cabin with a basket of fresh laundry. The wind played through her hair, tugging strands loose from the bonnet she had begun to wear habitually. She paused at the edge of the pasture, inhaling the scent of the land and the faint tang of the river. I watched her, sensing the tension that had accompanied her arrival slowly giving way to a tentative trust. She glanced at me, an acknowledgment of our shared understanding, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between the barn and the fading light, to the quiet companionship we had forged without grand declarations or promises. That night after supper, she spoke again of the Hollister brothers, of the persistence of their threats, and of the inevitability of returning to town for the inevitable court summons. I remained silent, listening to the cadence of her voice, noting the subtle shifts that betrayed both fear and determination. Her courage was not the absence of fear, I realized, but the deliberate act of moving forward despite it. And in that realization, I felt something stirring within me. A protective impulse, yes, but also a growing respect that bordered on admiration, a recognition of a spirit unbroken by circumstance. We sat together by the fire, its light dancing across the rough-hewn walls, and I noticed how naturally our presence had begun to coexist. No words were needed to convey the quiet bond forming between us. It existed in gestures, in shared labor, in the gentle acknowledgement of one another's humanity. She spoke softly of dreams, small and intimate, a garden she wished to cultivate, a kitchen that smelled of bread and warmth, a place where her choices mattered. And I, in turn, allowed myself to imagine mornings filled not with solitude, but with the sound of her voice, afternoons measured by shared tasks rather than enforced routine, nights softened by the presence of another steady soul. Yet, despite the comfort we had begun to construct, the shadow of pursuit remained. Town gossip, the inevitability of legal challenges, the lingering threat of the Hollister brothers, all of it pressed against the edges of our fragile sanctuary. And so, beneath the canvas of the wagon, within the protective walls of the barn, a tentative understanding took root. We were not merely sharing space, we were constructing a fragile refuge against a world that measured women by inheritance and men by the strength of their silence. As the first chill of evening brushed across the plains, Clara May moved toward the hayloft, pausing briefly to glance back at me. Her eyes, no longer wide with raw fear but reflective and wary, met mine with a quiet question. "Can I trust you to stand with me, not just shield me?" I felt the weight of that question settle against my chest. In that moment, the boundaries between protector and companion blurred. I realized that sheltering her was no longer a matter of kindness alone. It was the beginning of a choice I would make every day, to place another life alongside my own, to acknowledge the courage I had witnessed and the trust she had extended. And as the wind rose again across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and dust, I understood that our quiet existence had shifted. The world beyond the ranch still waited with its threats and its whispers, but here in this small corner of the frontier, a fragile alliance had been forged beneath canvas and timber. She was no longer merely a widow seeking refuge. She was Clara May Hollister, a woman claiming her right to breathe freely, and I, Elias Boone Calder, had become more than a solitary rancher. I had become a witness to courage, a guardian of dignity, and perhaps, though I would not admit it yet, the man beginning to reckon with an unfamiliar weight in his chest. The soft clatter of horse hooves echoed from the distant trail, a reminder that the outside world had not forgotten her, that danger lingered just beyond sight. She paused mid-step, listening, and the tension that had ebbed in the barn returned in a quiet, insistent pulse. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching, and for a long moment the horizon seemed to hold its breath with us. Beneath the faint glow of lantern light and the fading amber of dusk, the realization settled between us like dust upon the prairie. Refuge was temporary, courage was tested daily, and the heart, even when tempered by solitude, could be moved in ways neither of us yet fully understood. The morning air carried a crispness unusual for late summer, a fleeting promise that autumn might yet touch the plains before the relentless sun returned to scorch the earth. Clara May moved quietly through the cabin, the soft scrape of her boots against the wooden floor almost swallowed by the low murmur of the wind through the mesquite trees. I followed her eyes from the corner of the room, noting the way she lingered over the small details of my life. The chipped mug on the counter, the scuffed floorboards, the way the sunlight slanted across the windowsill. Each observation was a question, a measure of this place and of me, and I recognized the care in her attentiveness as both challenge and invitation. Shelter beneath the canvas of my wagon had become more than protection. It had become an examination, a weighing of what could be trusted and what could not. We worked side by side without speaking at first. I tended the horses, brushing the dust from their hides and checking the leather straps of their harnesses, while she sorted linens and polished the small iron stove. The rhythms of our labor were unremarkable, mundane even, but in them lay a quiet intimacy. Every shared glance, every careful movement in proximity, built a language neither of us yet named. When she paused to tie a loose sash on a curtain, I caught the delicate curve of her wrist, the way her fingers lingered over the worn fabric, and felt a tension in my chest I had not anticipated. Loneliness, I realized, had dulled me to subtleties, but her presence sharpened them into awareness. The world beyond the ranch might measure deeds and transactions and claims, but here, measure was taken in shared moments, in unspoken acknowledgments, in trust extended one cautious step at a time. That afternoon, the distant clatter of wagon wheels reminded us that the Hollister brothers had not forgotten her, and my pulse tightened as I considered the inevitability of their intrusion. Silas Crow had warned me days before that townsfolk whispered about a widow in the company of a solitary man, and those whispers had the power to twist intention into scandal. But Clara May did not seem concerned with rumor. She was concerned with reality. Her fears were tangible, rooted in what might be lost or taken, and her courage lay not in absence of worry, but in the deliberate choice to remain steadfast. When she finally spoke, it was with a calm that belied the undercurrent of anxiety. She asked if I thought they might come for her while we worked, and I answered honestly, perhaps, but we would face them together. That small pronoun, together, felt heavier than the hammer I wielded to mend a fence post, yet lighter in its promise. Evenings became a delicate choreography. I prepared the evening fire while she arranged the cabin with a precision that spoke of dignity reclaimed. She cooked with methodical care, each ingredient measured as if precision could ward off misfortune. I watched her, noting the subtle resilience in her movements, the way she turned ordinary tasks into acts of survival and grace. Conversation remained cautious, measured, yet the spaces between words were filled with understanding. She shared fragments of her life with her late husband, small stories of evenings spent in the mind's shadow, of laughter caught between hardships, of dreams deferred by circumstance. I offered pieces of my own history, careful not to burden, but unable to withhold entirely. My father's strictures, my solitary upbringing, the rhythms of a land that demanded endurance. These were the bones of my life, and she seemed intent on recognizing them without judgment. Days passed, marked by tasks and observation, but gradually a new weight settled in the space between us. It was not fear, though that lingered like a shadow. It was not affection, though warmth began to thread through the routine. It was a measure of what staying demanded of both of us. Shelter was no longer merely the absence of threat. It was a responsibility, an expectation, a choice. Clara May understood this as did I, and each act of care, each quiet interaction, became a subtle negotiation of trust. I felt the shifting balance in the way she moved through the cabin, the barn, the pasture. I felt it in the way she looked at the horizon, measuring the land not just for utility, but for its capacity to hold us both. One afternoon, the sun slanting low in gold across the plains, she paused at the edge of the pasture, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. I joined her, standing a respectful distance away, and we watched the cattle graze, the horses shift their weight, the light dance across the rolling earth. She spoke softly, almost to herself. The land feels different when one is not alone. I felt the subtle admission in her words, the acknowledgement that safety was not only about walls or fences but about presence, about knowing that another would meet the world with you. I said nothing immediately, letting her reflection linger in the space between us. The truth settled gently over us. The weight of staying was not a burden alone, but a shared measure of what it meant to care for another life beyond one's own. That night we sat by the fire, the glow illuminating the contours of her face and the careful tension in her posture. She spoke of dreams deferred, of plans that had been interrupted by loss, by circumstance, by expectation. I listened, noting the precision of her words, the way she weighed each syllable as if meaning were currency. I realized then that her courage was not a spectacle. It was quiet, patient, and enduring. She had chosen to remain despite fear, to persist despite uncertainty, and in that choice lay a power that could not be diminished by rumor, by threat, or by distance. I felt a stirring in my chest, a recognition that my own endurance, long defined by solitude and practicality, had room for something beyond mere survival. Days stretched into a routine where the threat from town lingered like a low hum, ever-present yet manageable. Clara May took to the land with care, tending small tasks with meticulous attention, her movements deliberate and self-assured. I observed her, noting how her presence seemed to animate the space around her, infusing the cabin, the barn, the pasture with a subtle order born of resilience rather than necessity. We moved in tandem, yet separately, each aware of the other's presence without intrusion. There was an intimacy in this careful proximity, a dialogue conducted in gestures and glances rather than words. The weight of staying was tangible. It was measured in shared labor, in quiet attentiveness, in the unspoken acknowledgement that our lives were now intertwined, however temporarily, in the pursuit of safety and dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a streak of crimson and amber, she paused at the cabin door, her silhouette framed against the fading light. Her eyes met mine, and I saw in them the faint trace of doubt mingled with determination. She spoke, not of fear, but of obligation. "The world will not leave us alone," she said, "and I must decide how much of myself to surrender to it." I nodded, understanding not just the literal meaning of her words, but the emotional weight they carried. Staying was not simply about avoiding the Hollisters or the town's scrutiny. It was about claiming agency in a world eager to deny it. It was about recognizing that courage could be measured in daily acts as much as in grand gestures. As night settled, the stars emerging like pinpricks of cold fire against the velvet darkness, we worked together to secure the barn, to ensure the horses were settled, to prepare for whatever intrusion might come. Her hands moved with confidence, precise and unhurried, while mine followed familiar motions honed over years of solitary labor. In the shared rhythm, a subtle understanding deepened. The weight of staying was not imposed by circumstance alone, but by choice. Each act, each precaution, each moment of attentiveness was a decision to remain present for one another, to carry together the burdens that life insisted upon. And in that recognition, I felt the quiet shift of something profound. Not love, perhaps not yet, but the nascent acknowledgement that hearts could align even amid uncertainty and threat. The next morning, the distant sound of hooves on the main trail carried through the thin walls of the cabin, drawing our attention in unison. Clara May froze for a heartbeat, her fingers tightening over the edge of the wooden table. I felt a corresponding tension, the familiar awareness that the outside world could not be held at bay indefinitely. The Hollister brothers, I suspected, had not forgotten, and though the immediate danger was uncertain, its presence was undeniable. She looked at me, eyes wide but measured, and in that gaze was a question that required no words. "Can we endure this together?" I nodded, and in that silent agreement, the weight of staying became tangible in the body, in the chest, in the steady grip of hands ready to act if necessary. The path ahead was uncertain, yet within that uncertainty lay the promise of agency, of choice, and of shared courage. In the quiet that followed, as the wind stirred the mesquite and carried the scent of dust and sage across the plains, I understood the truth we had been constructing day by day. Shelter was no longer just protection from physical threat. It was the deliberate creation of a space where dignity could survive, where courage could flourish, and where trust, once extended, could bind two lives together in defiance of the encroaching world. Clara May was no longer simply a guest beneath canvas. She was a partner in endurance, a witness to my own vulnerabilities, and a mirror for the quiet strength I had long forgotten to acknowledge within myself. The weight of staying, once merely a measure of responsibility, had transformed into a subtle promise, a pact that both protected and demanded recognition of the value inherent in every choice, every act of courage, every shared moment. As the shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, and the sun dipped low behind the distant hills, she turned to me with a glance that carried both inquiry and assertion. Her voice when it came was steady, measured, yet tinged with the faintest tremor of anticipation. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I must go to town. The court awaits. We both know that the Hollister brothers will be there, watching, questioning, waiting for an opportunity." I understood the implications immediately. This was not merely a legal challenge, but a test of all we had begun to build. The trust, the companionship, the quiet resilience, everything we had established in the shelter of the barn and beneath the canvas of my wagon, would be challenged in the light of the town, where judgment was swift and rumor had its own weight. Yet in her eyes I saw not fear alone but determination, a readiness to face what must be faced. And in that recognition, I felt the stirrings of a resolve that had been absent in me for years. To stand with her, to bear the weight of staying not as burden but as commitment, however uncertain the outcome might be. The town of Mesilla waited with a quiet scrutiny that made every step feel measured, deliberate, as if the earth itself leaned in to witness the unfolding drama. The dust of the streets clung to our boots, a fine powder that marked passage and presence alike, and the heat of midday pressed down, heavy and unyielding, like expectation itself. Clara May walked beside me, her skirt swaying just enough to betray the tension she carried, her bonnet shading eyes that flickered with determination and apprehension in equal measure. We approached the courthouse, its timbered facade sun-bleached and authoritative, the steps worn smooth by the passage of countless men and women who had come to answer claims, disputes, and the restless urgings of justice. The air smelled of ink, sweat, and old wood, a combination that carried the weight of decisions past and the anticipation of verdicts yet to come. I noticed how she held herself as we crossed the street, each footfall careful, deliberate, refusing to betray fear. The townsfolk had begun to gather along the edges of the thoroughfare, their eyes peering from doorways and shuttered windows, the whisper of gossip weaving through the crowd like the hiss of a dry creek. I could sense their judgments, the unspoken calculations that measured her worth, her propriety, the audacity of her presence beside me. Clara May did not flinch under their gaze. She met it with a quiet confidence that both unnerved and impressed me. I had seen courage before, but rarely had it been so deliberate, so unyielding, yet tempered with a softness that invited understanding rather than confrontation. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with the scent of ink and dust, mingling with the faint odor of perspiration from the men who had been waiting for hours. The benches were hard, unforgiving, and the sunlight through the tall windows cast long, angular shadows that seemed to underscore the gravity of the proceedings. Clara May's hands were folded neatly in her lap, the fingers tapping a silent rhythm of restraint and focus. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes traced the lines of the room as if reading its history, and I felt a swelling of protectiveness that had become almost constant since she first climbed into my wagon. Her courage was a steady flame, yet I knew it required acknowledgement, not adulation, and I remained silent, offering presence and a quiet readiness to act if required. The Hollister brothers entered shortly after us, their boots striking the floor with an echoing finality that drew the attention of the courtroom. Their eyes scanned the room, and when they found Clara May, their expressions shifted, a mixture of annoyance and calculation, as though her very existence challenged the legitimacy of their entitlement. They spoke with the ease of men accustomed to compliance, but the room had begun to change beneath their authority. Observers shifted in their seats, murmuring behind hands, noting the defiance in her posture, the clarity in her voice, the undeniable assertion of agency in her gaze. Clara May was not merely responding to accusation. She was shaping the space, defining her right to occupy it without fear or subservience. The judge, an older man with hair white as the winter frost and eyes sharp with the understanding of years, called the proceedings to order. The weight of his gaze fell upon her, yet it was not intimidating. It was measured, as if acknowledging that justice was not blind to courage. Clara May stood, voice steady and unwavering, presenting her claim with precision and clarity. She recounted the terms of the deed, the legality of her ownership, and the extent to which the Hollister brothers had sought to manipulate circumstance for their advantage. Her words were deliberate, paced with the care of someone who knew that clarity could be armor against both intimidation and rumor. I watched her, heart tightening not with fear, but with admiration, recognizing that every syllable carried the weight of her dignity and the years of quiet endurance that had brought her to this moment. The brothers attempted interruption, their voices rising with the force of entitlement and familiarity. Yet Clara May held her ground, meeting their challenges with calm articulation. She did not cede space. She expanded it, claiming the moral and legal high ground with a quiet assertiveness that left the courtroom measuring, re-evaluating, adjusting. Each exchange revealed her resilience, her intelligence, and her refusal to allow circumstance to dictate her response. I could sense the shift in the room. The air once thick with expectation and judgment now held a subtle respect, a recognition that courage and preparation could outweigh bluster and threat. Outside, the townsfolk pressed close enough to catch fragments of the dialogue through the open windows and doors, their expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. The whispered assessments that had followed her presence now faltered, unsure of the narrative they could assert in the face of such composure. Clara May's steadfastness was not just a shield for herself. It was a quiet defiance of a community conditioned to measure women by the convenience of others, a demonstration that dignity and determination could reshape perception. I remained near her, a steady presence, feeling the unspoken acknowledgement that the weight of staying, our decision to confront rather than evade, was both necessary and transformative. Hours passed within that room, each minute steeped in tension and expectation. When the judge finally rendered his decision, his voice carried the calm authority of one unshaken by intimidation. The deed remained in Clara May's name. Legally, she was the rightful owner. The Hollister brothers were bound by law, their claims nullified, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and grudging acknowledgement. Relief passed over her features, tempered by the awareness that legality did not erase scrutiny, that victory in court did not immediately dissolve the weight of observation and rumor that would follow her return to the plains. I noted the subtle exhale of her breath, a release almost imperceptible yet monumental in its implication, and felt my own shoulders relax slightly, though the awareness of continuing vigilance remained. The return to the ranch was quiet, the road stretching between us and Mesilla heavy with the weight of reflection. Clara May rode in the wagon beside me this time, no longer hidden, her posture upright, her eyes scanning the horizon with the measured attentiveness of one who has survived threat and emerged intact. We spoke sparingly, each phrase deliberate, each acknowledgement of the other's presence weighted with the awareness of shared trials. The wind stirred the canvas, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and in it, I sensed the subtle shift from mere survival to the beginnings of mutual understanding, the nascent foundation of trust extending beyond necessity into choice. As the plains stretched beneath the fading light, Clara May shared with me fragments of her thought, reflections on the court proceedings, and a quiet contemplation of what it meant to face judgment without flinching. Her courage had not relied on force or confrontation, but on clarity, preparation, and the unyielding assertion of self. I felt the subtle lesson in her example, recognizing that protection is not merely sheltering another from threat, but facilitating the space for agency, for decision, for the reclamation of power once threatened. The journey back to the ranch became a meditation on these truths, a silent acknowledgement that our shared experience had transformed both of us, shaping understanding in ways that extended beyond the immediate survival of the day. Night fell as we approached the rise where the ranch lay waiting, the stars emerging in a cold, brilliant spatter across the velvet darkness. Clara May's face was illuminated intermittently by the lantern light swinging gently in the wagon, highlighting both the relief of legal vindication and the lingering tension of returning to a world still watchful, still capable of imposing expectations and judgment. I noticed her eyes lingering on the horizon, contemplating not just the journey we had undertaken, but the implications of continued presence, the choices that lay ahead, and the necessity of balancing courage with prudence. Each observation, each measured thought, reinforced the weight of staying, reminding me that victory in one arena does not eliminate the challenges yet to come. Arriving at the ranch, I allowed her to dismount slowly, supporting her with a quiet steadiness that had become second nature. She moved with a deliberate grace, folding her skirts and adjusting her bonnet, as if asserting control over both her body and her narrative. The barn door closed behind us, the familiar scent of hay and leather, a temporary shield against the scrutiny of the world beyond the gate. We settled into the quiet routine of the evening, preparing feed and tending to the animals, yet the events of the day lingered, coloring every movement with the awareness of what had been confronted and what remained inevitable. There was a subtle joy in survival, a tempered pride in clarity and composure, but also the persistent undercurrent of vigilance, a reminder that courage is never absolute and that threat, even diminished, cannot be ignored entirely. By nightfall, we sat together on the porch, the stars reflecting the vastness of the sky above and the fragility of our human concerns below. Clara May spoke softly of the future, of what the outcome of the court meant, and of the subtle victories contained in assertion of self and property. Her words carried the resonance of someone who had reclaimed power without relinquishing dignity, who had navigated fear without surrendering it entirely, and who understood the delicate balance between action and patience. I listened, feeling the quiet swell of admiration, respect, and a curiosity I had long suppressed. The weight of staying, of choosing to remain present with another in the face of both challenge and expectation, had become palpable in the space between us. And yet, as the wind stirred the mesquite and the distant hum of Mesilla carried faintly on the night air, a subtle unease settled over us. Legal triumph did not erase the persistence of observation, the whispers that lingered in doorways and behind fences, nor did it diminish the vigilance required to maintain safety and autonomy. Clara May's gaze met mine, steady and unwavering, and in that unspoken acknowledgment, I understood the duality of our situation. Relief tempered by awareness, victory shadowed by the inevitability of continued scrutiny. The weight of staying had shifted once more, from immediate threat to enduring responsibility, and we both recognized that the quiet victories of courage and justice were merely preludes to the decisions that would define the life we were constructing together. As we settled for the night, the lantern casting long shadows across the cabin floor, I felt the stirrings of understanding, of possibility, of the fragile beginnings of something beyond mere survival. Yet the horizon, dark and infinite, carried the reminder that the world outside remained watchful, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Clara May's hand brushed briefly against mine as she adjusted her blanket, a silent affirmation of trust, connection, and shared determination. The day had ended, yet the consequences of action, the weight of choice, and the persistence of challenge stretched ahead, unseen but palpable. A reminder that courage is measured not solely in confrontation, but in the continued presence of steadfastness, integrity, and shared vigilance. The first light of dawn crept across the plains in soft ribbons of gold and rose, brushing the tops of the mesquite with a quiet insistence that day would come regardless of human hesitation. Clara May stood at the edge of the pasture, the wind teasing loose strands of her hair from beneath her bonnet, eyes tracing the horizon where the hills met sky. I approached slowly, boots crunching over the dry earth, aware of how every step carried the weight of unsaid words, of long-held restraint, of feelings we had skirted with civility and cautious glances. The ranch lay around us in gentle repose, the barn, the horses, the fences repaired in the rhythm of labor, but the air between us held a different tension, one electric with possibility, fragile yet undeniable. I had shielded her from the world, watched her courage bloom, and in doing so discovered my own heart had shifted beneath the quiet gravity of shared days. She turned as I stopped a pace behind, gaze steady and searching, and I felt the pull of something I could no longer deny. The world beyond the ranch had threatened her, yet here she was, unwavering, claiming life and autonomy in the open air, daring to breathe free of expectation. I wanted to speak, yet words lodged in my throat like stones, heavy with meaning and untested in their truth. For weeks I had measured my reactions, weighed my intentions, and now, with the vastness of sky overhead and the plains stretching endlessly before us, restraint seemed not only unnecessary but impossible. Her presence had filled my solitude with a warmth I had forgotten could exist, a companionship that demanded acknowledgement beyond mere protection. Clara May's voice broke the quiet first, soft but deliberate. I could see the faint tremor beneath her measured tone, the echo of vulnerability she had learned to carry with dignity. "Elias," she said, "I have faced them, faced their threats, and I have returned. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. I had measured the risk, and yet I stayed." And I looked at her, caught by the deliberate force of her gaze, the way her words mirrored the very courage that had led me to shelter her beneath canvas, to stand with her through whispered threats and the unrelenting weight of watchful eyes. I drew in a breath, the scent of dust and sage thick in the morning air, carrying with it the memory of our first moments together, the wagon rumbling over rutted trails, the tension of flight, the quiet of the barn where her resilience had begun to intertwine with my own. And I spoke, voice low at first, almost swallowed by the expanse of sky. "Clara May, I have watched you navigate fear and emerge unbroken. I have witnessed your courage, your intelligence, your grace, and in doing so, I have discovered a truth I can no longer suppress. My heart, long accustomed to solitude, has grown in a way it could not in your absence. I am not merely protective of you. I am bound to you, compelled by admiration, respect, and something more tender, more insistent. My words trembled in the open air, yet the honesty in them rang clear against the quiet of the plains. Her breath caught. She did not speak immediately, and in that silence I felt the depth of what I was confessing, the fragile territory into which we had ventured. My hands, once occupied only with reins and tools, ached to bridge the distance, to offer both reassurance and acknowledgement. I stepped closer, allowing the wind to carry the intensity of my presence, and continued, "My days without you were measured only by endurance, but with you, even in danger, in dust, in whispered threats, I have discovered the weight of wanting. Not for safety alone, but for the quiet companionship that fills a heart once resigned to emptiness. I do not ask for anything but permission to remain, to be by your side, and to let you see that what I feel is more than obligation. It is devotion." Clara May's eyes glimmered with unspoken emotion. Her lips pressed in a line that held both uncertainty and hope. She took a careful step forward, and I could feel the air between us shift, carrying a warmth that had been absent even in the glow of barn fires and candlelight. I saw in her expression the reflection of my own admission. Fear softened by trust, courage illuminated by acknowledgement, and a shared understanding that the world's scrutiny could not diminish what had taken root beneath open skies and laboring hands. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope that our alliance, forged in necessity, might bloom into something neither of us had dared name until this precise moment. Her hand found mine, tentative at first, brushing against the calluses and lines worn from years of solitude and work. The contact was simple, yet it carried a weight far greater than either of us had anticipated. She spoke then, voice steady, yet trembling with the vulnerability of hope, embraced cautiously, "Elias, I trust you. Not because safety demands it, not because propriety requires it, but because I have seen the measure of your character, the depth of your constancy, and the willingness of your heart. And in that I feel, recognized, seen, and understood in a way that makes fear bearable." Her words fell across the open plains like soft rain, each syllable watering a bond that had grown silently in the space between labor, vigilance, and quiet companionship. We stood together beneath the immense expanse of sky, the wind playing through her hair and my coat, the plains stretching endlessly in every direction, the horizon catching the first blush of sun upon distant hills. I drew her gently into the space beside me, hand entwined with hers, and felt the pulse of shared understanding. Courage acknowledged, trust extended, and hearts aligning in the hush of dawn. There was no need for grand gestures or ornate declarations. The world beyond the ranch still watched, still whispered, still measured our choices, but beneath that sky, with the wind and dust and the scent of sage surrounding us, we had created a sanctuary that required no validation but our own. I leaned close, voice barely above the rustle of the grass, and said simply, "Clara May, I love you. Not as a fleeting impulse or a concession to circumstance, but as a truth I have carried quietly until this moment, until the open sky demanded it, until the weight of staying and choosing had made clarity unavoidable." Her gaze held mine, luminous with emotion, and in that instant, the air seemed to hold its breath, the plains pausing in reverence to the confession exchanged between two souls who had endured fear, uncertainty, and the relentless judgment of others. She responded not with words alone, but with a quiet acknowledgement, a tilt of her head, a hand pressing more firmly into mine, affirming that this revelation was received, cherished, and mirrored in the depths of her own heart. The moment stretched, fragile yet infinite, as if the earth itself recognized the significance of a love born not of convenience but of courage, not of fleeting passion but of shared trials and steadfast presence. And in that stillness I knew that the weight of staying, once measured by necessity and vigilance, had transformed into something far greater. The deliberate choice to remain, to witness, to protect, and to cherish. Beneath the open sky, with dawn gilding the plains, the confession carried both a promise and a reckoning, a thrilling declaration that neither danger, rumor, nor past sorrow could erase the bond we had forged. And as Clara May squeezed my hand, a soft smile brushing her lips, I felt a pulse of certainty. Together we would endure, together we would thrive, and together we would face whatever horizon awaited us, hearts finally unburdened and aligned,